The early light stretched long and pale across the dust-choked yard of the Fort Bridger trading post, turning wagon ruts into lines of shadow and smoke into a low-gray veil. The air carried the mixed scent of burned pine, leather, and wet horse. One of those places where worlds pressed up against each other without ever truly meeting. Here, iron rails and ledgers brushed against old trails and older ways, and men traded pelts, whiskey, and sometimes pieces of themselves. Eli Boone shifted the leather strap across his shoulder, aware of the familiar pull of the bow resting against his back. It was an old Apache bow, shaped from white ash taken near sacred water, its surface smoothed by years of use. It had followed him through countless hunts, carried quiet prayers spoken under open sky, and held the memory of hands long gone. At 26, Eli moved with the steady restraint of a man who knew the land was changing faster than seasons ever had, and not in his favor. The trading post hummed with noise and friction. Bearded trappers in worn buckskin argued over beaver prices with sharp-eyed merchants who smelled of ink, soap, and distant cities. Soldiers in faded blue lounged against the plank walls, rifles always close, eyes drifting restlessly as if trouble might ride in on the wind. Wagon trains creaked through the yard, canvas tops bleached bone white by the sun, bound for California promises that grew thinner with every mile. Eli had come down from the Powder River country with little to show for 3 hard weeks. The great herds were gone. Game that once filled the plains had scattered or vanished, driven off by rails, rifles, and hunger that did not belong to the land. Elk stayed high in the mountains now. Even the deer seemed to understand that the old balance had been broken. His paint stallion, Dustwind, snorted softly as Eli reached the hitching rail. The horse's ribs showed faintly beneath his winter coat, proof of lean months settling in early. Eli swung down, tied the reins with practiced ease, and straightened despite the deep ache that lived in his bones. Inside a deerskin pouch at his belt lay the sum of his hunt: 3 hides, a few rabbit pelts, and several antler tips prized by traders for buttons and knife handles. Barely enough for powder and shot, certainly not enough to carry a family through winter. The interior of the post felt like a collision frozen in wood and dust. Bolts of calico leaned beside bundles of sage and sweetgrass. Iron pots shared shelf space with beaded moccasins. Bottles of laudanum stood in careful rows next to dried bark his grandmother once claimed could ease any troubled spirit. Behind the rough counter stood Caleb Drayton, red beard streaked with gray, eyes sharp with the habit of measuring need. He looked up as Eli approached, his face settling into guarded neutrality. "Well, I'll be," Drayton said, forcing a grin. "If it ain't Boone, what brings you down from the high country? You got something worth my trouble today?" Eli placed his small bundle on the counter without ceremony. Drayton's hands moved over the hides, checking thickness, feeling for flaws. His expression stayed flat, but Eli caught the brief tightening at the corner of his eyes. "Lean season," Drayton muttered, lifting one hide toward the light. "Markets are thin since the war ended. Too many boys back east think the frontier owes them a fortune." The war, he meant, had burned for 4 long years far away. But its reach had found even these mountains. More soldiers, more wagons, more families with nothing left to lose. Eli had heard the stories at night, brothers killing brothers, towns turned to ash. A white man's war, fought for white reasons, spilling consequences everywhere. "What will you give?" Eli asked, his English steady but heavy on his tongue. It served for trade, but it lacked the depth of his own language, where words carried the land inside them. Drayton rubbed his beard, pretending to weigh the matter. $15, he said at last. And that's generous, all things considered. It was less than Eli wanted, more than he had expected. He nodded once, already thinking of powder, of winter, of what would not stretch far enough, no matter how carefully it was spent. $15 would stretch just far enough. Powder and shot for another month, or a sack of the white man's grain to shore up the thinning stores of wild rice and dried meat his family relied on when winter closed in. As Caleb Drayton counted out the coins, silver stamped with the hard-set face of the great father in Washington, his expression shifted. A spark lit behind his eyes, a look Eli Boone had learned to distrust. It was the look of a man who had found a way to profit from another person's trouble. "Say, Boone," Drayton said, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "You ever think about taking yourself a wife? A man in your position could use help. Someone to keep the fire, work the hides." Eli didn't answer. His stillness seemed to invite the trader on. "There's a situation that might suit a young man like you?" Drayton glanced around to be sure no one was listening. "Family came through yesterday, name of Holloway, bound for Oregon, hit hard luck, lost a wagon crossing the Green River, most of their supplies gone. They're desperate enough now to consider arrangements." The way he said it made Eli's skin crawl, but he waited. "They've got a woman," Drayton continued, voice dropping lower. "Widow, Clara. Lost her husband to fever back in Missouri. She's been traveling with her late husband's brother and his family. Trouble is, the brother's buried in debt, serious debt, and winter's coming fast." A cold settled in Eli's gut. He had heard of this before. Families selling their own blood to settle accounts or buy passage west. It sickened him, even as he knew such bargains were becoming common as the frontier filled with people chasing promises that kept slipping farther away. "She's got no say," Drayton went on, mistaking silence for interest. "Brother-in-law holds her papers. He's looking for someone to take her off his hands in exchange for enough coin to get his family to Oregon before the snow locks the roads." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the trading post's boards and sending dust skittering across the yard. Eli heard children laughing, the sound folding into the creak of wagon wheels and the lowing of cattle. Somewhere in that ordinary noise was a woman whose fate was being weighed like freight. "How much?" Eli asked. The words tasted like ash. Drayton's grin widened. "That's the spirit. He's asking 50. But a man with the right touch might talk him down to 40, maybe 35. More than you're carrying, I know." His eyes slid to the bow on Eli's back. But a smart trader knows there's more than one way to settle a debt. The knot in Eli's stomach tightened. The bow was more than a weapon. It was his father's legacy, white ash, backed with real sinew, marked by old prayers spoken low. It had fed his family for generations, bound him to the land and to the balance between hunter and hunted. "That's fine work," Drayton said softly, circling. "A piece like that's worth more than money. Worth respect. Worth a man's name. I bet I could find someone willing to trade a woman's papers for it." Eli closed his eyes and saw his father's face, weathered, steady, teaching him to read the wind, to feel the ground speak through his feet, dawn after dawn. They had moved through timber and shadow together, listening more than they watched. The bow had been there for all of it, a bridge between worlds. When Eli opened his eyes, Drayton was still studying him with the patience of a man who knew how to wait. "I need to see her first," Eli said. Drayton's grin faltered. "See her? This isn't a horse trade." Then he sighed, shoulders slumping. "Suit yourself. The Holloways are camped about a quarter-mile east, near the creek. You'll spot them by the busted wheel and the smell of desperation." Eli pocketed the $15 and stepped back into the sun. The bow across his shoulders felt heavier now, as if reminding him of every promise he had ever made. And the cost of keeping them. As Eli Boone loosened the reins and swung into the saddle, his thoughts drifted forward, not back, toward a woman he had never met. A woman named Clara Boone. Her future rested on choices made by men who had never asked what she wanted, never cared whether she carried dreams of her own. The wind rose as Eli turned Dustwind toward the creek, bringing the sharp scent of sage and the faint warning of snow riding high on the air. The Holloway camp lay along Willow Creek like a marker for broken hopes. Eli smelled it before he saw it. The harsh smoke of green wood, the sour trace of bodies gone too long without water, and beneath it all, the unmistakable odor of defeat. One wagon sagged at an angle. Its shattered wheel leaned against a cottonwood, like a rough headstone. Canvas that had once been bright now wore the colors of dust and rain, patched with scraps of cloth that told a story of slow surrender. 2 oxen grazed nearby, ribs pressing against their hides, while a few chickens scratched half-heartedly at the hard earth. Eli dismounted at the edge of camp, leading Dustwind by the reins. His arrival didn't go unnoticed. A man in a worn brown coat rose from beside the fire, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip with the tense reflex of someone who had learned to expect trouble. "You're lost, friend," the man called, his Missouri drawl edged with fatigue and bitterness. He looked to be near 40, thinning hair, pale skin, built more for ledgers than long trails. His clothes, though travel-stained, had once belonged to a man who counted money instead of cattle. "Name's Eli Boone," Eli said, stopping a respectful distance from the fire. "Caleb Drayton at the trading post said you might be looking to make arrangements before winter." The man's face shifted, weariness giving way to sharp, hunted calculation. "Frank Holloway," he replied, extending a hand that trembled despite him. "Drayton sent you, did he?" "Figures. News moves fast when folks get desperate." Around the fire, Eli saw the rest of the family. A thin woman, Edna Holloway, clutching a baby, 2 children pressed against her skirts. But it was the woman seated apart that drew his eye. She wore a faded blue dress and stared into the dying embers, as if reading her future there. Even in the hard afternoon light, hair pulled tight, face marked by miles and loss, Clara Boone carried herself with a quiet dignity hardship had not managed to strip away. She looked to be about 25. Her beauty came not from softness, but from strength. The firm line of her jaw, the steady set of her shoulders, the way she stood separate from the family's desperation while still bound to it. "Drayton told you about our situation," Frank said, lowering his voice, shame creeping into it. Eli nodded. "He said you were trying to settle debts before heading west." Frank let out a short, bitter laugh. "Debts. That's the clean way to say it." He gestured toward the broken wagon. "Lost everything crossing the Green River. Wagon, supplies, my brother's tools. God rest him. The company back in Independence won't honor claims for acts of wilderness. That leaves me holding his debts and his widow." For the first time, Clara lifted her eyes from the fire. They were gray as a gathering storm. When they met Eli's, something shifted in his chest, sudden and sharp. Like an arrow finding its mark, there was no pleading in her gaze, no appeal for rescue. Only a calm, resigned strength, the look of someone who had already accepted that her life no longer belonged to her. "Clara was my brother Will Holloway's wife," Frank went on, unaware of the silent exchange. "Good woman, never caused trouble. But Will left debts back in Missouri, gambling debts, truth be told. Men he owed aren't the forgiving kind. They made it clear someone in the family would pay." Eli's jaw tightened. He had heard stories like this whispered around winter fires. Seeing it unfold in front of him, watching a woman weighed like freight, lit a cold anger inside him. "What are you asking?" Eli said, though he already knew no amount of money could truly cover it. Frank glanced at Edna, who turned away, unable to watch. $40, he said quickly. Enough to get my family to Oregon before the snow closes the passes. In return, you get Clara's papers and her cooperation. She works hard, knows a kitchen, a needle. She won't cause you trouble. The words hung in the air, heavy and foul. Eli looked again at Clara, saw how tightly her hands were clasped in her lap, knuckles white. She said nothing, but her silence spoke louder than any plea ever could. Has anyone asked what she wants? Eli Boone asked quietly. The question seemed to catch Frank Holloway off guard, as if the notion of consulting a woman about her own future were as strange as speaking a foreign tongue. Want? He echoed, blinking fast. She understands the situation. We all make sacrifices. She knows her duty to the family. Do I have a choice in this? Clara Boone spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft, steady, clear as water over stone. There was no bitterness in it, no accusation. Just a simple question asked by someone who already knew the answer. Frank's face flushed. Clara, don't make this harder than it has to be. You know we can't take you to Oregon. We barely have enough for our own children, and the men back in Missouri. He let the sentence die, but the threat lingered between them. Eli felt the weight of his father's bow across his back, the smooth white ash shaped by hands that had never known such humiliation. He remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell, women honored as life-givers, keepers of wisdom, guardians of the sacred fire. The scene before him felt like cold smoke against starlight. $40 is a heavy sum, Eli said carefully. I don't carry that much coin. Frank's shoulders sagged, then his eyes flicked to the bow. Drayton said you might consider other forms of payment. His gaze stayed fixed there. That's a fine weapon, worth more than money to a man who understands it. Eli's world narrowed to a single point. The bow was not just a tool. It was his name, his past, his place in the world. Without it, he would be another displaced hunter watching his people's way of life fade like morning mist. But as he looked at Clara, sitting straight-backed and dignified despite being bartered like livestock, he understood that some things outweighed pride and tradition alike. The bow was my father's, Eli said slowly, and his father's before him, white ash cut near sacred water. Frank's eyes lit with the hope of a drowning man. Then you know its worth. A piece like that. It's more than money. It's reputation. Eli slid the bow from his shoulder and held it, feeling the familiar balance, the small imperfections his hands knew by heart. He could almost hear his father's voice, teaching him the wind, the ground, the patience of listening. If I give you this, Eli said, what assurance do I have she'll be treated with respect, that her wishes matter? Frank frowned, confused. Respect? She'll be your wife, won't she? That's more than most women get. Eli looked to Clara again. This time, she met his gaze without flinching. There was no gratitude there. No desperation. Only a careful, wary measuring, as if she were judging what kind of man stood before her. Do you have belongings? Eli asked her, ignoring Frank's startled protest at being cut out of the exchange. Clara glanced once at her brother-in-law, then back to Eli. A few things, she said quietly. Will's Bible, some clothes, a locket that was my mother's. Get them, Eli said. Then he turned to Frank and extended the bow. This for her papers and her belongings. She comes with me by her own will, or there's no deal. Frank seized the bow with shaking hands, turning it over with greedy relief. Agreed, he said quickly. Edna, fetch Clara's things. We'll want to be moving before sundown. As Frank hurried off to prepare the papers, travel-worn documents speaking of marriage and death in the cold language of law, Eli stood beside Clara while she gathered her few possessions into a small canvas bag. Why? She asked without looking at him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Eli watched her fold a simple cotton dress with the care of someone who had learned how far little things must stretch. Because no one should be sold like a horse, he said at last. She looked up then, and for a brief moment, something passed between them. Not trust, not understanding, but the first quiet spark of recognition. Two people pushed together by forces neither had chosen, both searching for a shred of dignity inside a bargain that offered very little of it. I won't be a burden, Clara Boone said. Her chin lifted just enough to steady herself. I can work. I don't complain. I'm not looking for a servant, Eli Boone answered. I don't even know what I'm looking for. Frank Holloway approached with the papers, the ink still fresh and uneven from his hurried hand. Everything's settled, he said, not quite meeting Eli's eyes. She's legally your responsibility now. Eli took the documents without reading them, folded them once, and slipped them inside his jacket. Words on paper had never meant much to him. His people had learned long ago how easily promises dissolved once they were written in a white man's hand. What mattered was the woman beside him, packing the remains of her former life into a bag light enough to carry with one arm. Clara said her goodbyes to Edna Holloway and the children with a quiet grace that held sorrow tightly in check. Tears were shed, but without sound. When she turned to follow Eli toward his horse, her back stayed straight, her steps sure. Eli helped her mount behind him on Dustwind, aware of the careful space she kept even as she settled close. The horse shifted under the added weight, then stilled, as if sensing this ride carried more than distance. As they left the Holloway camp behind, Eli felt the absence of his father's bow like a missing limb. Behind him, Clara, now Clara Boone according to the papers, sat with the balance of someone who had learned not to lean too heavily on anything that might be taken away. They rode in silence as Fort Bridger came into view, its wooden walls offering shelter without promise. Two strangers bound by necessity, carrying choices already made and futures not yet shaped. The afternoon sun stretched their shadows long across the grass, two outlines merging into one. Eli's home stood a mile north of the post, tucked among cottonwoods where Willow Creek bent lazily toward the hills. It was a modest place. Part lodge, part frontier cabin. Log walls rising waist-high before giving way to stretched hide over pine poles. Smoke slipped out through an opening at the top, and the whole structure seemed to hunker low against the land, alive and watchful. Clara slid down from Dustwind without help, movement slow and deliberate as she took in her surroundings. The silence that had followed them from the camp now pressed in, heavier in the gathering dusk. "This is your home?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Eli nodded, leading Dustwind toward the lean-to where hay and grain waited in rough bins. "It serves," he said. "Warmer than a lodge in winter, cooler than a cabin in summer." He had built it 3 years earlier, after his father died. The old ways had grown too heavy to carry alone. The lodges of his people needed many hands, needed community. This place was a compromise, an attempt to honor the past while accepting the life of a man who stood between worlds. Clara followed at a measured distance, canvas bag in one hand, the other smoothing her dust-stained dress by habit. Everything about her spoke of someone guarding what little dignity remained. There's a place for you to sleep, Eli said, lifting the hide flap that served as a door. Food if you're hungry. The creek water's clean. Inside, the lodge was dim and smoky, lit by a single oil lamp and the glow of banked coals. Smaller than any cabin Clara had known, but orderly. Sleeping robes laid out on one side, cooking tools arranged with care on the other. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the frame, filling the air with sage and sweet grass, scents that clung to Eli's clothes. What struck her most was how foreign it all felt. The smells, the sounds, the way shadows curved along the walls. She had traveled 2,000 miles from Missouri, yet the distance here was more than miles. It was the distance between worlds. I'll sleep outside, Eli Boone said, mistaking her wide-eyed silence for fear. At least until you're comfortable with all this. Clara Boone turned toward him, the lamplight catching the gray in her eyes as she studied his face. Mr. Boone, she began, then hesitated, unsure what title fit a man bound to her by papers, yet standing so carefully apart. Eli, he said quietly. Just Eli. Eli, she repeated, testing the sound. I want you to know I'm grateful for what you did today, truly, but I also need you to understand that I won't. She stopped, color rising in her cheeks as she searched for words polite society never taught women to say aloud. Eli lifted a hand, gently cutting her off. I didn't trade for a wife, he said plainly. I traded for a woman's freedom. What you do with that freedom is your choice. The words lingered in the smoky air, and Clara felt something tight in her chest ease just a little. Then why? She asked. Why give up something so valuable for someone you didn't even know? Eli stared into the fire for a long moment, as if the answer might rise from the flames. My father used to say a man isn't measured by what he can take, he said at last, but by what he's willing to give up. He looked at her then, dark eyes reflecting firelight. Maybe I needed to find out what I was worth. The honesty unsettled her. For a heartbeat, the careful distance she'd kept wavered. Then reality pressed back in. She was alone with a man she barely knew, in a place that felt as foreign as the far side of the moon, dependent on kindness that could vanish as quickly as it appeared. I'll earn my keep, she said, falling back on practicality. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I'm not afraid of work. Eli nodded, though something in his expression suggested the offer didn't sit easily with him. We'll figure it out, he said. For now, rest. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles. He was right. Neither of them could have guessed how soon those troubles would arrive. At dawn, Clara woke to voices outside. Men speaking in a language that flowed like water over stone, urgent and sharp. Through the hide walls, she saw shadows moving, tension carried in tones that needed no translation. She dressed quickly and stepped out to find Eli standing by the cold ashes of last night's fire with 3 Apache warriors. They were young, close to his age, lean and watchful, built for long days in the saddle. Beaded shirts showed beneath wool coats, braided hair marked with feathers, cartridge belts crossing their chests, modern rifles resting easily in their hands. The exchange was heated, carried entirely in their native tongue. Clara caught Eli's name spoken with reproach, and that was enough. One warrior, his left cheek marked by a long scar, gestured sharply toward her, his voice rising. Finally, Eli answered with something short and final. Silence fell. The scarred man fixed Clara with an open glare, before speaking one last time to Eli, his tone like winter wind. Then all 3 mounted and rode off, leaving frost-bitten tracks that would vanish by noon. Friends of yours? Clara asked once they were alone. Eli crouched to rebuild the fire, movements quick and practiced. Chayton, the one with the scar, is my cousin, he said without looking up. The others are from our band. They heard about the trade. What did they say? He glanced at her, something like shame flickering across his face. They said I dishonored my father's memory, that I traded his spirit weapon for a white woman who'll bring nothing but trouble. He fed another stick into the flames. They said I've forgotten who I am. The words stung more than Clara expected. She had known their arrangement would draw notice, had understood what it meant for a hunter like Eli to stand with a woman like her. Hearing it spoken so bluntly drove home how fragile her place truly was. Maybe they're right, she said quietly. Eli looked up sharply. About what? About the trouble, she replied. I've brought you nothing but problems, and I've only been here one night. He was silent, tending the fire with the patience of someone who knew not everything could be fixed at once. Chayton judges fast, he said finally. He sees the world in clean lines, Apache and white, honor and shame. But the world doesn't fit that way anymore. As if to prove him right, the next challenge arrived before the morning had fully warmed. Captain Owen Hale, commander of the Fort Bridger garrison, rode up with 2 enlisted men. Hale was a career soldier, uniform pressed despite frontier dust, mustache waxed to regulation neatness. Their government-bred horses stood tall and well-fed. Boone, Hale called out, remaining in the saddle in a deliberate show of authority. I hear you've gone and taken yourself a white wife. That true? Eli Boone stepped forward at once, placing himself squarely between the soldiers and Clara Boone. The movement was easy, almost casual, but it carried a warning no one missed. And what concern is that of the Army, Captain? Captain Owen Hale's smile was thin, sharp as paper. Everything that happens in this territory is Army business, Boone, especially when it comes to mixing races. That sort of thing has a way of causing trouble, for everyone. The threat was quiet, but unmistakable. Clara had heard enough frontier stories to understand what military concern could mean. A white officer with a grudge could make life unbearable for an Apache man who drew the wrong kind of attention. Eli's independence gave him some protection, but only up to a point. The woman is legally my wife, Eli said. His voice stayed level, but there was an edge to it that made the soldiers' horses shift and stamp. The papers are signed and witnessed. Papers can be revoked, Hale replied smoothly. Especially when questions come up. Questions about coercion, about whether a Christian woman was forced into an unholy arrangement with a savage. The word savage lingered in the cold morning air, like smoke from damp wood. Bitter, choking. Clara felt heat rise in her chest, not for herself, but for Eli, who had shown her more respect in a single day than her own kin had in years. Before he could stop her, she stepped forward. I wasn't forced into anything, she said clearly. I entered this arrangement of my own free will. Hale's attention snapped to her, sharp and predatory. Is that so, ma'am? Funny thing, there was a fellow named Frank Holloway in town last night. Drank himself loose and talked plenty. Said he traded his sister-in-law to an Apache for the price of his passage west. Doesn't sound much like free will to me. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her. The careful story she'd built, the idea of choice, threatened to collapse under Holloway's drunken words and the captain's scrutiny. She'd known the truth would surface someday. She just hadn't expected it so soon. Frank Holloway is a desperate man, she said, drawing on a steadiness she didn't know she still possessed. He'll say anything for a bottle. Whatever tales he's telling have nothing to do with my life now. Hale studied her face, weighing her the way men like him always did, searching for cracks. Maybe, he said at last. Still, I'll be keeping an eye on things. The Army has a duty to protect white women from unnatural situations. With that, he turned his horse and rode off. His men followed, stiff-backed and disciplined, carrying the polish of parade grounds into a land that cared little for it. Silence settled once they were gone. Eli and Clara stood side by side, both understanding the same truth. Their fragile arrangement had just become something far more dangerous. They were no longer simply two people trying to survive an unusual bargain. They were symbols now. "This is what I meant about trouble," Clara said quietly. Eli nodded, eyes fixed on the dust cloud fading into the distance. "The captain wasn't wrong about one thing," he said. "Papers can be revoked. Laws can be bent. If they decide you're being held against your will." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. In a land where military authority often outweighed civil law, Hale's disapproval could mean far more than harassment. It could shatter the thin safety Eli had carved out for her. As the sun climbed and frost melted from the grass, they returned to the work of living. Eli tended Dustwind, checked his traps, kept busy with the habits that grounded him. Clara explored the lodge, learning its rhythms, trying to understand a life shaped by needs far simpler and harsher than anything she'd known. Beneath those ordinary motions lay a shared awareness. They were living on borrowed time. The world beyond the cottonwoods would not long tolerate their uneasy alliance. Still, for the first time since leaving Missouri, Clara felt something she'd nearly forgotten. The faint, dangerous possibility that her life might belong to her again. Even if only for a while. 3 weeks passed like autumn leaves in the wind, some days racing by, others hanging suspended in the clear October air. Frost silvered the mornings. Eli rose before dawn to tend the fire, while Clara prepared their plain breakfasts of cornmeal and whatever meat his snares provided. An unspoken order settled between them. Eli slept outside beneath buffalo robes and stars. Clara claimed the lodge as her own. By day they worked near one another, speaking only when necessity demanded it. "The water bucket's low. I'll check the snares by the creek." The silence wasn't unkind, just heavy with caution. They moved like two people learning a dance, neither fully understood, stepping carefully, trying not to collide, aware that good intentions alone would not bridge the distance between them. It was a Tuesday morning. The sky the dull gray of old pewter, with snow threatening but not yet falling. When the careful distance between them finally began to fracture. Eli Boone had left before dawn, riding high into the meadows to hunt deer, hoping to add to their winter stores before the hard cold set in. Clara Boone spent the morning at the creek, washing clothes in water so cold it burned, her hands reddening and going numb as she worked stubborn road dust from her few worn dresses. She had just finished hanging the damp garments on a line strung between two cottonwoods when she heard it. The fast, reckless drumming of hooves. 4 riders burst from the trees at a gallop, their laughter and whoops slicing through the thin air like wolves on a chase. Even from a distance, Clara knew they weren't soldiers. Their clothes were too rough, their riding too loose, too careless for men bound by discipline. These were frontier men of a darker sort. Men who hadn't come west to build anything, only to outrun what they'd already ruined. The one in front was thick through the chest, his beard graying at the edges, his eyes carrying the sharp, unfocused shine of someone who'd been drinking despite the early hour. The others were younger, lean and hard, the look of men who used fear as currency. One of them passed a half-empty whiskey bottle from hand to hand as they rode. Clara's first instinct was to retreat to the lodge, but the way they fanned out as they approached told her running would only make her prey. So she stayed where she was, beside the clothesline, her hands steady even as fear climbed her throat like ice. "Well now, look at this, boys," the bearded man called as they reined in a short distance away. "Seems we found ourselves a little dove, all alone out here." The man with the bottle laughed, sharp and ugly. "Mighty pretty dove." The leader swung down from his saddle with deliberate slowness, the confidence of a man who believed the world bent for him. "I heard tell there was a white woman living out here with one of them Apache hunters. Stirred up quite a bit of talk down at Morrison's." Clara lifted her chin, drawing on the same brittle dignity that had carried her through worse. "My husband will be back soon," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I suggest you move along." "Your husband?" The man grinned, teeth dark with tobacco. "That what you call him?" "Funny thing is, ma'am, some folks might question whether a good Christian woman can really be married to a heathen savage." The others dismounted now, forming a loose circle. They moved with lazy menace, emboldened by numbers, whiskey, and the knowledge that no law stood close enough to matter. "Truth is," the leader went on, stepping nearer, "we figured we'd be doing you a favor, taking you out of this godless mess. Plenty of proper white men over in Oregon Territory. Men who could give you a decent Christian home." "I don't need your help," Clara said firmly, though she felt the edges of her composure starting to split. "I'm exactly where I choose to be." The youngest of them, a boy really, with thin whiskers and mean eyes, snorted. "Choose? You expect anyone to believe you chose this? Sleeping with a savage, eating their food, praying to their devil spirits." "Watch your mouth, Tom Kearns," the leader warned mildly, more amused than angry. "No need to be crude. We're just here to rescue a lost lamb. Ain't that right?" They closed in, and Clara found herself edging back toward the creek, knowing the icy water would offer no escape. Her mind raced. The rifle Eli kept inside the lodge was too far. Even if she reached it, she doubted she could use it in time. "Please," she said, hating the word as soon as it left her mouth, "just leave me alone." "Can't do that," the leader replied. "Wouldn't be Christian, leaving a white woman in sin." His hand reached out, fingers brushing her sleeve. And then the arrow struck. It punched clean through his shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in the frost-dusted grass. His scream hadn't finished echoing when thunder rolled from the trees. Eli Boone burst into the clearing astride Dustwind, his cry splitting the morning air like steel. He carried no bow. That had been traded away. But he had a rifle, and he moved with the deadly grace of a man born to the saddle. The three remaining men scrambled for their weapons, but Eli was among them before they could react. The fight was fast and savage. He vaulted from Dustwind and smashed the butt of his rifle into Tom Kearns's face, dropping the boy in a spray of blood and broken teeth. The man with the bottle swung it wildly, but Eli ducked and drove a fist into his gut, folding him in half. The fourth man managed to draw his pistol, just as Clara, acting on raw instinct, snatched up a stone from the creek bank and hurled it. It struck the gunman's temple, staggering him long enough for Eli to seize him, wrench the pistol free, and end the fight where it stood. When the violence finally broke apart, 3 of the attackers lay groaning in the dirt, while the leader clutched the arrow buried in his shoulder, his face drained of color by shock and pain. "Get out," Eli Boone said quietly. His voice carried no heat, only the flat certainty of death. "Take your men and leave. If I see any of you near this place again, I'll kill you." The man staggered to his feet, swaying as blood soaked his sleeve. "This ain't over," he rasped. "You savage, you can't keep her here against her will. There's laws." I'm not being held against my will. Clara Boone spoke before she realized she would. Her voice was steady, stronger than she felt. These men attacked me. Eli protected me. If anyone broke the law today, it was you. For a heartbeat, it looked as though the man might argue. Then he saw Eli's stance, balanced, coiled, ready, and thought better of it. He and his men gathered themselves, hauled the youngest upright despite his shattered nose, and rode off hard, as if distance alone might save them. When they were gone, Clara found herself sitting on a fallen log by the creek, her hands shaking now that fear no longer needed to be hidden. The morning that had begun with washing clothes and thinking about breakfast felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Eli approached slowly, careful, as if she might bolt at any sudden movement. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, unable to trust her voice yet. The truth of what had nearly happened settled over her like cold ash. Without him, those men would have taken her, rescued her, they would have said, into another kind of prison. "Thank you," she managed at last. "They would have come closer if I hadn't heard the horses," Eli said simply. "I knew they didn't belong." He sat beside her, leaving space between them. For the first time, Clara really looked at him, not as the stranger who had bought her freedom, not as something unfamiliar and distant, but as the man who had ridden straight into danger for her. His breathing was slow, controlled, the way it was after violence. A thin line of blood marked his knuckles where he had struck Tom Kearns. His dark hair had come loose during the fight, framing a face younger than she had first thought, maybe only a year or two older than her own 25. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" she asked, nodding toward the place where the arrow had dropped the man. "My father," Eli said. He flexed his fingers, easing the stiffness. He said a man who couldn't hit what he aimed at had no business calling himself a hunter. She hesitated, "Even without your bow." Something passed across his face. "I made another," he said quietly. "Not like my father's. But it works." The words carried more weight than he seemed to intend. He hadn't just given up a weapon. He'd surrendered a piece of himself, his link to those who came before him. And he had done it for her, a woman once valued only by another man's debt. "I threw a rock," Clara said suddenly, "at the one with the gun." Eli nodded once. "Good throw. Might have saved my life." The recognition settled between them. Shared danger, shared action, each moving without hesitation to protect the other. It was small, but it felt like the start of something solid. "Your hands are bleeding," Clara said. Without thinking, she reached for him, turning his hand palm up. His skin was darker than hers, worn by sun and wind, but warm. She had expected his hands to be rough, and they were. But there was care in the way he let her hold them, as if he feared his strength might hurt her. "I should clean these?" she said softly. Eli nodded and didn't pull away. "Clara," he said, speaking her name carefully. She looked up at him. Those men, what they said about choice, they weren't entirely wrong. You're here because of circumstances, not because you wanted to be. If you want to leave, go to Oregon or back east. I won't stop you." The offer hung between them in the crisp autumn air. She realized then that this was the first time since Missouri that anyone had truly asked her what she wanted. "And if I choose to stay?" she asked. Eli was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing an absent pattern across her palm. "Then we figure out how to make this work," he said. Together, it wasn't a declaration of love. They barely knew one another, not really. But it was something else entirely. Something quieter, sturdier, a beginning. The kind that might, with patience and care, grow into love someday. It was a promise of partnership. Two people choosing to face an uncertain future side by side instead of alone. "I'll have a lot to learn," Clara Boone said. "Your customs, your language, how to live out here." "And I'll need to learn yours," Eli Boone answered. "About books and letters, about the world beyond these mountains." They walked back toward the lodge together. Clara carrying the basket of damp laundry, Eli leading Dustwind by the reins. And something subtle shifted between them. The careful distance remained, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like open ground, like soil waiting for seed. The first snow began to fall just as they reached the lodge. Thick, slow flakes that promised winter had arrived in earnest. Inside, as Eli fed the fire and Clara prepared their midday meal, the warmth came from more than burning wood. For the first time since this strange arrangement had begun, neither of them felt completely alone. November arrived hard and fast. Snow piled high, turning the land into a glittering wasteland, and the cold grew sharp enough to steal a man's breath. The mountains vanished behind curtains of white. The creek ran dark between banks of thickening ice. It was the kind of winter that separated those who endured from those who didn't. Inside the lodge, Eli and Clara found a rhythm that felt almost natural. The violence of the attack had broken something open between them, making room for small kindnesses and shared moments. Clara began teaching Eli his letters using her late husband's Bible, guiding his finger along the page. In return, Eli showed her how to prepare traditional foods and read the signs of approaching storms. But beyond their small shelter, the world was growing restless. The first warning came on a Tuesday morning with the arrival of Luke Drayton, Caleb's younger brother. Luke was a thin, nervous man whose clothes never quite fit, the sort who lived on rumors and worried constantly about being left behind. "Figured you'd want to know," Luke said, stamping snow from his boots but declining Eli's offer to come inside. His eyes flicked toward the lodge as if expecting Clara to appear. "There's talk down at the fort. Bad talk." Eli waited, knowing Luke would take his time. "That business with Rafe Calder and his men," Luke continued. "Word spread about what happened here. Captain Owen Hale has been asking questions, real pointed ones." "What kind of questions?" Eli asked. Luke lowered his voice. "Whether the woman was coerced, whether the marriage papers are legal, whether Judge Amos Ridley even has the authority to dissolve a union folks might call unnatural." Cold settled in Eli's gut, sharper than the wind. "And what's Hale decided?" "Nothing yet," Luke said quickly. "But there's more. Your cousin, the one with the scar. Chayton." Eli's jaw tightened. "He's been talking to the younger warriors," Luke went on, "saying you betrayed your people, that you traded your father's spirit for white man's corruption. Says the spirits are angry, that bad medicine follows men who abandon the old ways for white women and white man's papers." The words hit harder than Eli expected. Rejection from white authorities was something he had prepared for. But being cast out by his own people, having his choices labeled betrayal, cut deeper than winter cold. "There's talk of a council," Luke added quietly. "Bands gathering to decide what should be done about warriors who forget their blood." After Luke left, Eli stood alone in the snow, staring at the mountains that held his ancestors' bones. Isolation pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. Too heavy to bear, too necessary to discard. Inside the lodge, Clara was preparing their evening meal. Her movements were steady, practiced now. She had adapted to this life with a resilience that still surprised him. But Eli could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she paused now and then, as if listening for trouble. "Luke brought news," Eli said as he came in, brushing snow from his moccasins. Clara looked up, her gray eyes searching his face. "Bad news," she said softly. Eli sat by the fire, accepting the bowl of stew she offered. He didn't answer right away, but she already knew. The rabbit was tender, meat from Eli's snares, seasoned with wild onions and the herbs Clara was learning to recognize. It should have been comforting, this quiet meal by the fire. Instead, every bite tasted dull, as if the air itself had gone stale. "The army's asking questions about our marriage," Eli Boone said at last, his voice flat. "And my people are questioning whether I've abandoned the old ways." Clara lowered her bowl. Whatever hunger she'd had vanished. "What kind of questions?" Eli repeated what Luke Drayton had warned him, word for word. As he spoke, Clara felt the meaning settle heavily in her chest. When he finished, the only sound between them was the crack of firewood and the wind scraping snow against the lodge walls. "They could take me away," Clara said quietly. "They might try." "And your people?" she asked. "What would they do to you?" Eli stared into the flames. In them he saw familiar faces, men who had taught him to hunt, to ride, to honor the land. "Exile," he said. "They'd cast me out, declare me dead to the band. It's happened before." The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as he looked at Clara, saw the firelight strengthen the lines of her face, Eli realized something that unsettled him even more. The idea of losing her frightened him far more than exile ever could. 3 days later, the storm finally broke. Eli was checking his trap line along the creek when he heard horses, many of them, moving with the steady discipline of trained men. He turned back toward the lodge through the snow-laden trees, his new bow strung, though he knew it would mean little against soldiers. Captain Owen Hale waited in the clearing, mounted, flanked by 8 men of the frontier cavalry, rifles ready. Beside them stood Frank Holloway, rigid with unease, and another man Eli didn't recognize. A thin figure in a black coat, posture stiff with borrowed authority. Clara stood in the lodge doorway, wrapped in one of Eli's buffalo robes. The fur nearly swallowed her, making her look smaller than she was, but her chin was lifted in defiance. "Mr. Boone," Hale called, smooth and sharp. "Kind of you to join us. We have business." Eli stepped forward, fully aware of the rifles tracking him. "What business is that, Captain?" Hale gestured to the man in black. "This is Judge Amos Ridley, appointed by the Territory. He's here to investigate reports of coercion and unlawful restraint." Ridley cleared his throat. "Mr. Boone, I have reason to believe you acquired Miss Carter through a transaction that failed to consider her consent or welfare. I'm here to offer her a return to civilized society." "Her name is Clara Boone," Eli said evenly. "And she can speak for herself." "Can she?" Ridley asked coolly. "Mr. Holloway here says otherwise." Frank Holloway stared at the ground. "I've come to take her home," he said stiffly. "Back to decent people who'll treat her right." "Decent?" Clara's voice cut through the cold. "You mean the same people who sold me to cover your debts?" Frank flushed. "I was trying to help you. You couldn't come west with us. We barely had supplies." "So you sold me?" Clara said, stepping forward despite the guns. "Don't call it mercy. You needed money, and I was all you had left." Ridley raised a hand. "The past is secondary. What matters is whether this woman is being held against her will, in violation of territorial law and Christian decency." "I am not being held," Clara said clearly. I chose to stay. I choose to remain with my husband. Husband? Ridley scoffed. The territory does not recognize unions between whites and Indians, especially those formed through trade. The word struck Eli hard, stripping away the thin protection he'd believed their papers gave them. If the territorial government refused to recognize their marriage, then Clara was, in the eyes of the law, a white woman being held by an Indian, a condition that justified whatever force the army chose to apply. The papers are legal, Eli Boone said, though he could hear the doubt threading his own words. They were signed freely. Signed under pressure, Captain Owen Hale cut in smoothly, by a woman with no real alternatives. I had alternatives, Clara Boone said, stepping forward. I could have gone to Oregon with Frank's family. I could have gone back east. I stayed because I chose to. Choice? Judge Amos Ridley laughed, sharp and brittle. What choice does a respectable woman have when abandonment means freezing in the wilderness? You remained because you were cornered, not because you wished to consort with a savage. The word hung in the air like smoke. Eli felt his grip tighten on his bow. Across the clearing, rifles shifted in practiced unison, tracking the movement. Choose now, Hale said, his tone carrying the weight of command. Come with us willingly, Mrs. Carter, and we'll see you safely to Oregon, or Missouri, if you prefer. Refuse, and we'll conclude you're being held against your will by a man with no lawful claim. Eli looked at Clara. He saw fear there, uncertainty, but also resolve. He could fight. He could loose an arrow, try to reach the lodge before the soldiers cut him down. But violence would only prove their worst suspicions. Worse, it would leave Clara alone to face the consequences of his bloodshed. It's your choice, he said quietly, the words scraping his throat raw. Whatever you decide, I won't stop you. For a moment that felt endless. Clara stood between two futures, the safety of her own people and the fragile, uncertain life she'd built here. Snow drifted down around them, softening the scene, muting sound like a benediction. I choose to stay with my husband, she said. The words fell heavy and final. Something opened in Eli's chest, not the pain he'd braced for, but a warmth he'd been afraid to hope for. Clara stepped to his side, close enough that he felt the heat of her through the cold. Hale's expression hardened. Eli saw it then. This wasn't over. The patrol withdrew in a tense stalemate. As the frontier cavalry rode off through the swirling snow, Hale's parting words lingered like a sentence already pronounced. This matter isn't settled, Boone. The territory protects its citizens, whether they ask for it or not. For 3 days afterward, a suffocating quiet wrapped their lodge. Eli checked the tree line again and again, searching for movement, for the glint of metal in the snow-heavy branches. Clara moved through their routines with determined calm, but he saw the tightness in her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked at every sound. The blow came from where neither of them expected. It was Thursday evening when hooves thundered out of the dusk. Not the measured cadence of soldiers, but the reckless charge of men fueled by whiskey and grievance. Eli snatched up his rifle and peered through a slit in the hide wall. 6 riders were bearing down on the lodge, scarves pulled high against the cold. He recognized the lead horse at once, a big bay gelding. "Get away from the door," he snapped. "Go to the back. Stay low." Clara didn't hesitate. She gathered her skirts and moved with swift, practiced care, crouching behind their bedding, her face pale but steady in the firelight. Outside, the riders circled once, snow spraying from their horses' hooves, voices raised in drunken bravado. Eli counted weapons. at least 3 rifles, likely pistols beneath their coats. "Boone?" Rafe Calder's voice cut through the night, slurred but sharp with long-nursed rage. "Come on out, you murdering savage. Time to settle accounts." Eli Boone stayed silent, checking the load in his rifle and measuring angles in his head. The lodge's thick walls would stop most small arms fire, but 6 men with time and ammunition could break through anything. His best chance was to make them come close, force them into tight space where numbers meant less. "We know you're in there, Boone," another voice shouted. Tom Kearns, the youngest of the whiskey runners. His words were slurred, thick with the hatred of a man whose broken nose had never healed right. "And we know you got that white woman with you." Time she learned what happens to women who choose savages over Christian men. The threat sent ice through Eli's veins. It also hardened something in him. Whatever happened tonight, they would not touch Clara Boone. He would die first, and take as many of them with him as he could. The attack came from 2 sides at once. 3 men dismounted and rushed the front, firing as they advanced, while the others circled hard for the rear. Rifle shots cracked in the confined clearing, bullets thudding into logs. Eli waited until the front group was nearly at the door. His first shot dropped the man on the left, a scream slicing the night. The other 2 dove behind a fallen tree, but they were exposed. His second shot sent them scrambling. Behind him came the tearing sound of hide as the rear attackers cut into the back wall. Eli spun, knife in hand, but Clara moved first. She'd grabbed the iron poker from the fire. When the first man shoved through the ripped wall, she brought the poker down with everything she had. He fell hard, blood spilling, his rifle clattering across the floor. The second man raised his pistol toward her. Eli crossed the lodge in 2 strides. His knife found the space between ribs. The man gasped once and collapsed, the unfired weapon spinning away into shadow. Outside, Rafe Calder shouted orders, trying to rally what was left. But half his men were already down, and the rest were realizing their easy target had turned deadly. "Burn them out," Calder screamed. "Set the place on fire." Eli smelled coal oil. Lamp fuel splashed against the outer walls. The hide would ignite fast, the logs would follow. "We have to go," Eli said, grabbing his rifle and what ammunition he could carry. "Back way, now." They moved toward the breach just as hoofbeats thundered in from the dark. Eli froze, more riders cutting off escape, until he heard a voice he knew. Chayton called out, his words sharp and commanding in the Apache tongue. The gunfire stopped, confusion erupted, then the clash of bodies, short and violent. Through the torn wall, Eli saw muzzle flashes and heard Apache war cries. Chayton had come with a war party. Minutes later, silence returned. Eli and Clara stepped out into the wrecked clearing. Chayton stood over Rafe Calder's body, his scarred face hard in the flicker of burning oil meant for their destruction. "Cousin," Chayton said, his voice stripped of warmth. "You have brought trouble to our people." Eli helped Clara to her feet, checking her quickly. She was shaken but unhurt, dress torn, hair loose, poker still clenched in her hands. In the firelight, she looked like a fighter herself. "I brought no trouble," Eli said in English so Clara could understand. "They came here to murder us." Chayton's gaze shifted to Clara, studying her like a problem he hadn't expected. "The white woman fought," he said. "I saw her strike one down." "She saved my life," Eli replied. Something flickered across Chayton's face. Surprise, maybe the start of respect. He'd expected fear. He'd seen resolve. "The soldiers will come," Chayton said, gesturing at the bodies. "When they see this, they will blame you." Eli nodded. Captain Owen Hale had been waiting for a reason. 6 dead white men would give the territorial authorities all the justification they needed. It would not matter that those men had come as attackers, that they had threatened murder and fire. In the eyes of frontier law, Eli Boone was still an Indian who had killed whites, and that alone was enough to invite brutal retribution. "You cannot stay here," Chayton said flatly. "They will return with soldiers, many more than we can fight." "Then where do we go?" Clara Boone asked. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him. Her voice was steady, stripped of fear, and Eli felt a surge of pride at her resolve. Chayton studied her for a long moment, the hard lines of his face easing just slightly. "There are places high in the mountains where the frontier cavalry does not ride," he said. "Caves, old shelters. A man and a woman could survive the winter there, if they are strong." "And after winter?" Eli asked. Chayton's smile was grim. "After winter, the world may be different. Or you may have learned to live as our ancestors did, when the only law was survival." They salvaged what little they could from the wreckage of the lodge. Charred hides, a handful of tools, ammunition pulled from the snow. As Eli loaded the saddlebags, the weight of finality settled over him. This place had been his compromise, his attempt to stand between the old world and the new. Now it was gone, reduced to ash and blood in a single night. Yet as he watched Clara secure her few belongings, he realized the loss cut less deeply than he'd expected. What mattered was the woman beside him, the one who had stood her ground in fire and violence, and proved herself worthy of his trust. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, as they prepared Dustwind for the climb. "This isn't the life you bargained for." Clara looked once more at the smoking remains of their home, then turned back to him. Something like the beginning of a smile touched her mouth. "I didn't bargain for a life," she said. "I bargained for the right to choose my own fate." They rode into the darkness behind Chayton and his warriors, toward mountain passes sharp with ice and danger. As Clara leaned against him in the saddle, Eli felt his understanding of her shift. She was no longer the desperate widow taken from Frank Holloway's greed, no longer the frightened outsider learning strange customs. She was Clara Boone, a woman tested by blood and fire, who had chosen uncertainty over false safety, partnership over submission. The mountains ahead were merciless, but for the first time since surrendering his father's bow, Eli felt something like hope. Whatever trials waited in the high country, they would face them together. The cave Chayton led them to was little more than a split in the mountain's face, hidden behind ice-laden pines and reachable only by a narrow ledge that fell away into a canyon lost in shadow. As Eli helped Clara through the opening, he understood at once what kind of place it was. The sort desperate people came to die, and also the kind the cavalry would never find. "It isn't much," Chayton said, gesturing to the cramped chamber. "But the spring at the back does not freeze. You can keep a fire without smoke showing on the cliff." The cave stretched perhaps 20 feet inward. The ceiling was just high enough to stand. Moisture seeped through the stone where underground water pressed close. The cold bit deep, frosting their breath. But it was shelter, and shelter now was worth more than gold. "There are deer trails on the eastern slope," Chayton continued, unloading their supplies. "Fish in the pools below. The old ones lived like this for whole seasons, until their enemies forgot them." He paused, then looked at Clara with a thoughtful expression earned during the brutal climb. "The woman fought well," he said first in Apache, then in English. "She did not cry. She did not slow us." He nodded once. Perhaps I was wrong about white women. It was the closest thing to an apology Chayton would ever give. Eli accepted it with a quiet nod. His cousin had risked his standing, and perhaps his future, to give them this chance. In the high wilderness, with winter closing in, that chance was everything. By helping them escape, Chayton had gone against his own long-held beliefs, that the mixing of white and Apache blood only led to ruin. The fact that he had done so meant something in him had shifted, changed by witnessing Clara Boone's courage under fire. When Chayton and his warriors finally departed, slipping down the mountainside like shadows at first light, Eli Boone and Clara were left truly alone for the first time since their uneasy bond had begun. The silence inside the cave was immense. It pressed in on them, broken only by the wind sighing through stone and the faint murmur of the hidden spring, and that would keep them alive through the brutal winter ahead. "Well," Clara said at last, her voice echoing softly off the rock walls, "I suppose we'd better make ourselves at home." The days that followed tested every ounce of strength and ingenuity they possessed. The thin mountain air turned even simple tasks into ordeals. Hauling firewood left them breathless, their lungs burning. The cold felt alive. Seeking gaps in clothing, moments of carelessness, any weakness it could exploit. Yet slowly, almost impossibly, they adapted. Eli taught Clara to read the moods of the mountains, to recognize the subtle warnings of avalanches and sudden storms. She learned to move quietly across treacherous slopes, to set snares for small game, to find hardy plants that could still be eaten deep into winter. In return, Clara taught Eli things he had never learned to value. She showed him how written words could carry not just meaning, but feeling. How stories preserved on paper could keep the voices of the dead alive through long, dark nights. Sometimes she read aloud from her late husband's Bible, not to preach, but for the beauty of the language itself. "Listen to this," she said one December evening, firelight flickering across the page as she read from the Song of Solomon. "Set me as a seal upon thine heart, as a seal upon thine arm. For love is strong as death. The coals thereof are coals of fire, which hath a most vehement flame." Eli listened to the rhythm of the words, how they moved like living things in the glow of the fire. "Your people wrote this," Clara said softly, "long before America, before territories. But the feelings, they're the same everywhere, aren't they?" It was during moments like these that Eli realized something between them had changed. The careful distance they had once maintained, the invisible lines that defined their arrangement, had worn away so gradually he couldn't say when they vanished. Now they sat close by necessity. Warmth came as much from shared body heat as from their small fire. Yet the closeness no longer felt dangerous. It felt right, like coming home. The truth became undeniable in late January, when a blizzard trapped them inside the cave for 3 endless days and nights. The storm roared down from the peaks, winds sharp enough to kill exposed flesh in minutes. Snow fell so thick it erased the world beyond their entrance. On the second night, the cold sank so deeply into the stone that even their fire struggled to hold it back. Clara began to shake uncontrollably. Her lips turned faintly blue, a sign Eli knew too well. "No amount of blankets will fix this," he said quietly, opening his own sleeping robes. "Body heat is the only way." She came to him without hesitation. He wrapped them together in every covering they owned. Her skin was icy against his, her body trembling violently as it fought the cold. For hours he held her, sharing his warmth while the storm screamed outside. Slowly, the shivering eased. Her breathing steadied. She relaxed against him, and even then, neither of them pulled away. "Eli," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the wind. I'm not sorry. Not for the trade, not for the lodge, not for this cave. I'm not sorry. Something broke open inside him, a wall he hadn't known he'd built. Neither am I, he said, his hand moving gently through her hair. I thought I was trading for your freedom. I didn't know I was trading for my own. She lifted her head to look at him, gray eyes reflecting the dying firelight. When did you know? She asked. When did you realize this was more than an arrangement? Eli thought back through the months of quiet change. When you fought back, he said at last. When you chose to stand instead of cower. That's when I knew you weren't someone I rescued. You were someone I wanted beside me. For me, Clara said softly, it was when you offered to let me leave. When Captain Owen Hale came, and you told me the choice was mine. No one had ever asked me what I wanted, and meant it. The kiss that followed needed no words. At first, the kiss was hesitant, almost unsure. Then it deepened, as the careful restraints they had clung to finally fell away. It tasted of wood smoke and winter air, of vows made in darkness, of hope kindled where none should have survived. When they finally parted, Eli Boone found himself looking at Clara Boone as if truly seeing her for the first time. She was no longer the desperate widow he had pulled from Frank Holloway's greed, no longer the wary stranger who once sat apart from his fire, afraid to trust a man whose ways were foreign to her. She was his partner, his equal, the woman who had earned the name she now carried. I love you, Clara said simply. The words carried no hesitation, only truth. Not because you saved me, not because circumstances trapped us together, but because of who you are. Because you were willing to give up your father's bow so a stranger could be free. And I love you, Eli answered, his hand cupping her face with a tenderness his younger self would never have believed possible. Because you reminded me what it means to choose for yourself, instead of bowing to what the world demands. Outside, the storm still howled. Inside their small refuge, wrapped in one another's arms, Eli and Clara discovered something more precious than warmth. They had found home. The nights that followed were filled with quiet words and gentle discoveries. They learned one another with the patience of explorers charting unknown ground, finding in touch a language that bridged worlds once thought impossible to cross. Clara taught Eli the pleasure of slow mornings, of laughter shared over simple rituals. Eli showed her the sacredness of connection, the belief that love could be an offering to the spirits who watched over wild places. When spring finally came, loosening winter's grip and opening the mountain passes once more, they emerged from the cave like people reborn. The woman who descended the narrow ledge was not the same one who had fled in fear from Captain Owen Hale's threatened justice. She walked with the certainty of someone who had claimed her place in the world, someone who had learned that love was not something that happened to you, but something you chose day by day against a world determined to tear it apart. They traveled farther from Fort Bridger, deeper into country where territorial law carried little weight. Along the way, Eli carved a new bow from mountain ash, its wood hardened by wind and elevation into something stronger than his father's had ever been. Yet the bow was no longer the most important thing he carried. That honor belonged to the woman riding beside him, her hand brushing his now and then as they followed an uncertain path toward the life they would build together. In the end, his father had been right. A man's worth was measured not by what he could take, but by what he was willing to give up. Eli had surrendered his bow, his place among his people, his certainty and safety. In return, he had gained everything that mattered. 2 years later, on a morning when the aspens burned gold and the air hinted at autumn, Eli and Clara stood on a ridge overlooking the valley they now called their own. Below them, smoke rose from the chimney of the cabin they had built together. A home that blended both their worlds, with solid log walls and a roof that could open to the sky when the old spirits were to be honored. The sound that drew their attention grew louder. The distant whistle of a locomotive threading through the mountain passes, carrying settlers, merchants, and dreamers west. "They're building a station at Devil's Creek," Eli said, watching the dark plumes scar the sky. "Word is they'll have regular runs to Denver within a year." Clara nodded, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly, where their first child grew, quiet proof of the future. "Does that worry you?" she asked. Eli thought of the long road behind them, of the peace they had carved from wilderness, of a life that belonged fully to neither world, yet honored both. "Not anymore," he said at last. "Let them lay their rails and raise their towns. This place will still be here when the iron rusts and the towns are forgotten." And he knew it was true. He understood it even as the words left his mouth. The valley held a kind of permanence that made the worries of men who measured progress in miles of rail and tons of ore seem small. Here, where Eagle Creek ran cold and clear between willow banks, where elk still crossed meadows untouched by plow or fence, the old rhythms endured. Seasons turned. Life renewed itself. They had learned to live inside those rhythms, taking only what they needed and leaving the rest to breathe. Eli Boone's hunting brought meat and hides for trade, while Clara Boone's garden yielded hardy vegetables that softened their reliance on the wild. They sold what they didn't need to trappers and prospectors passing through the high country, men who valued good workmanship and paid honest prices. Yet none of that measured their real success. Their true wealth was the life they had chosen together, built slowly, day by day, decision by decision, through hunger and plenty alike. "Do you ever miss it?" Clara asked, settling beside him on the stone warmed by the late sun. "The life you had before, your people, the old ways." Eli watched a hawk circle high above the valley before answering. "I miss my father sometimes," he said quietly. The stories he told, the way he read the land like other men read newspapers. He paused, then shook his head. "But the people made their choice when they cast me out. And the old ways." He shrugged. "They couldn't survive what was coming. Maybe this is better. Taking what was good from both worlds and leaving the rest behind." The months after they came down from the mountain cave had not been easy. They lived like hunted souls at first, moving camps often, trading only with men they trusted, always alert for signs that Captain Owen Hale's reach might still extend into their refuge. But time moved on. New troubles claimed the Army's attention. Fresh scandals replaced old stories. Gradually, they slipped into the quiet anonymity the wilderness grants those wise enough to accept it. Chayton visited once, the previous spring. He rode into the valley with 2 young warriors and news of the outside world. The Apache bands, he said, were being forced onto reservations, freedom narrowed by treaties that seemed to shrink with every passing year. "Some speak of resistance," Chayton told him, "of one last war." "And you?" Eli had asked. Chayton had looked around the valley, at the cabin, the garden, the horses grazing free, the peace written into every corner of their lives. "I speak of survival," he said at last, "of holding on to what matters while the world changes." He stayed 3 days, long enough to see how Eli and Clara worked as equals, how they had shaped something new from broken pasts. When he left, he carried a letter Clara had written, words meant for any of Eli's kin who might wonder what became of the hunter who traded his father's bow for a white woman. The letter spoke of respect and love, of old traditions honored and and new paths forged. It spoke of children who would know both languages, bound by neither world's limits. Now, sitting together on the ridge as the locomotive's whistle faded into distance, that future felt close. The child Clara carried would be born in the moon of falling leaves, when aspens shed their gold and elk sang from the high meadows. "What should we name the baby?" Clara asked, her hand moving in slow circles over her belly. Eli placed his hand over hers, feeling the quiet movement beneath. "If it's a boy," he said, "I'd like to call him Will, to honor what came before and what we chose after." Clara's eyes filled, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. "And if it's a girl?" "Hope," Eli said without pause, "because that's what she'll be. Hope for a world where a person's worth matters more than the color of their skin." As the mist burned away and morning rose, they walked back down toward the cabin and the steady work waiting there. Wood to split, vegetables to gather, winter plans to prepare. The simple labor of a life that was finally their own. At the door, Eli paused. His eyes went to the bow hanging above the threshold, the one he had carved from mountain ash during their second winter, shaping it by firelight while the wind screamed through the peaks. It was a fine bow, strong, balanced, but it was not his father's. That bow was gone forever, traded for something far more valuable. "No regrets?" Clara asked, following his gaze. Eli looked at his wife, his true wife in every way that mattered, and felt the familiar warmth rise in his chest. She was no longer the frightened widow who once sat beside Frank Holloway's fire. She was a woman who had claimed her strength and chosen her own life. "None," he said. "A bow can be replaced. What we have, this is the hunt of a lifetime." Somewhere high on the ridges, a wolf howled, its call carrying the ancient loneliness of wild places. But here, beside the woman who had chosen exile with him, Eli felt no loneliness at all. He had found what every hunter seeks, not just sustenance, but purpose. In Clara's love, he had discovered land worth defending. In their shared future, a pursuit worthy of a lifetime. The bow above their door was only a tool. The love they had built was a living flame, one that would outlast weapons and borders alike, passed down through their children like a sacred fire. As they stepped inside their home, Eli Boone finally understood what his father had tried to teach him long ago. The greatest hunt was never for elk or buffalo. It was for the one soul who could turn solitude into belonging. He had traded his bow for that truth. It was the finest bargain he would ever make. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals, narration, and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.